Picture a time when England teetered on the edge of chaos, a kingdom torn apart by ambition, betrayal, and the relentless thirst for power. The Wars of the Roses wasn't just a clash of armies. It was a shadowy game of thrones where loyalty shifted like the wind, and even the most trusted allies could vanish without a trace. Behind the bloodshed and the battles, there are secrets buried so deep they've puzzled historians for centuries. Why did key figures disappear at the most critical moments? What really happened to the princes in the tower? And how did a conflict so brutal suddenly end with an unlikely king rising from obscurity? These aren't just footnotes in history, they're enigmas wrapped in riddles, and they hold the key to understanding one of the most turbulent periods England has ever seen. Think about standing in the middle of a medieval battlefield, the air thick with the smell of smoke and the cries of soldiers, but the real drama wasn't just in the fighting. It was in the whispered conspiracies, the forged documents, the sudden, inexplicable deaths that changed the course of history overnight. This was a world where truth was as fragile as parchment, and the line between fact and legend blurred with every passing year. Some of these mysteries might never be solved, but that's what makes them so gripping. Were the Yorkists truly betrayed from within? Did Margaret of Anjou really orchestrate the downfall of her enemies through sheer cunning? And what dark forces lurked behind the sudden downfall of Richard III? That's where this journey begins. Over the course of this exploration, we'll uncover 25 of the most baffling, chilling, and utterly fascinating mysteries of the Wars of the Roses. Each one peels back another layer of deception, another twist in a saga where nothing was ever as it seemed. Some of these events might sound like something out of a medieval thriller, except they really happened. And by the end, you'll see this turbulent era in a whole new light. So settle in, because we're about to step into the shadows of history, where every answer leads to another question, and the past refuses to stay buried. One of the darkest enigmas of the Wars of the Roses begins with two boys, Edward V and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York. Heirs to the English throne, they were last seen playing in the Tower of London in the summer of 1483 before vanishing without a trace. Their disappearance wasn't just a tragedy, it was a political earthquake that shattered trust, ignited rebellions, and stained the reign of their uncle, Richard III, with accusations so damning they've echoed for centuries. But what really happened to the princes in the tower? The most widely accepted theory is also the grimmest, that Richard ordered their murders to secure his hold on the crown. After declaring the boys illegitimate, he had them placed in the tower for protection, only for them to never emerge again. Decades later, two small skeletons were discovered beneath a staircase in the tower, fueling suspicions. Yet Richard's defenders argue there's no direct evidence tying him to the crime. Some point to Henry VII, who later seized the throne and had just as much to gain from their deaths. Others suggest they may have been quietly smuggled away to safety, with rumors persisting for years that one or both princes survived in secret. The mystery deepens when you consider the players involved. Was Richard truly the villain history remembers, or was he framed by Tudor propagandists to justify Henry VII's rule? Even the supposed confession of Sir James Tyrrell, a knight who allegedly admitted to the murders under torture, is riddled with inconsistencies. And then there's Perkin Warbeck, the pretender who decades later claimed to be Richard, Duke of York, rallying rebellions with his story. Was he an impostor, or could there have been a sliver of truth in his tale? What makes this mystery so haunting isn't just the question of guilt, it's how the uncertainty shaped history. The prince's disappearance became a weapon, used to justify wars and vilify kings. Without a body, without conclusive proof, the truth slipped into shadow, leaving us with fragments of evidence that point in every direction at once. 500 years later, we're still picking through those fragments, still asking, who killed the princes, or did anyone kill them at all? Richard III wasn't the only one with motive to remove the princes from the chessboard. Enter Henry VII, the Tudor king who toppled Richard at the Battle of Bosworth. If the princes were still alive when Henry took the throne, they were living threats, legitimate heirs who could rally Yorkist loyalists against him. Henry's actions afterward raise eyebrows. He backdated his reign to before Bosworth, effectively rendering any surviving princes traitors by default. Then there's the curious case of Elizabeth of York, the prince's sister and Henry's queen. Did she truly believe her brothers were dead, or was her marriage to Henry part of a darker bargain to bury the past? The Duke of Buckingham, once Richard's staunch ally, also falls under suspicion. His sudden rebellion against Richard in 1483, the same year the princes vanished, hints at a possible falling out over their fate. Some chroniclers whispered that Buckingham, not Richard, gave the order to silence the boys, perhaps hoping to clear his own path to the crown. But like so much in this mystery, the evidence is circumstantial. Buckingham was executed for his revolt, taking any secrets to his grave. Modern investigators face a frustrating reality. Nearly every piece of evidence is wrapped in propaganda. Tudor historians painted Richard as a monster, while his supporters insisted he was framed. Even the famous skeletons found in the Tower in the 17th century can't be conclusively linked to the princes without DNA testing. Their identities remain guesswork. And that's the heart of the problem. This isn't just a cold case, it's a battle of narratives where even forensics hit dead ends. Yet technology might still crack this enigma. Imagine if those tiny bones could be tested against descendants of the Plantagenets, or if a lost letter surfaced in some dusty archive confessing the truth. Until then, the prince's fate lingers in that eerie space between history and legend. A ghost story woven into the fabric of England's past, waiting for someone to finally separate fact from fiction. The morning of April 14, 1471, dawned with an unnatural haze clinging to the fields near Barnet, a thick, rolling fog that would twist the fate of England in ways no one could have predicted. As the Yorkist and Lancastrian forces clashed in one of the most pivotal battles of the Wars of the Roses, visibility dropped to near zero. Soldiers stumbled blindly, their shouts muffled by the mist, their banners indistinguishable shadows. This wasn't just inconvenient weather, it was a veil of chaos that turned the tide of history. At the heart of the confusion was the Earl of Warwick, the so-called Kingmaker, whose Lancastrian forces found themselves attacking their own allies in the murk. The Yorkists, led by Edward IV, had deliberately positioned their lines offset from the enemy, a tactical gamble that became lethal when the fog descended. Warwick's men, disoriented and desperate, mistook the banners of their comrades, the Oxford family star and stream emblem, for Edward's son in splendor symbol. The result, a brutal wave of friendly fire that shattered Lancastrian morale. By the time the fog lifted, Warwick lay dead in the mud, his legendary influence snuffed out in a single, bewildering morning. But here's where the mystery takes a darker turn. Chroniclers of the time didn't just describe the fog as heavy, they called it unnatural, a manifestation of divine wrath or even sorcery. Some whispered that Warwick's own mother, known for her dabblings in astrology, had foreseen her son's doom in the stars. Others pointed to the timing. The battle occurred on Easter Sunday, a day of resurrection, yet one marked by eerie, almost purposeful disarray. Was it really just a freak weather event, or did something, or someone, manipulate the elements to shape the outcome? Modern historians lean toward the practical. Barnet's low-lying ground, combined with the smoke of early gunpowder weapons, likely created the perfect conditions for that blinding fog. Yet even science can't fully explain why the mist clung so persistently to the Lancastrian lines, or why it dispersed only after Warwick's death. The battle's legacy is a paradox, a clash where chance and chaos decided the future of a kingdom, leaving us to wonder whether the hand at work was meteorological or something far older and far stranger. Long before Richard III or the Vanished Princes, another scandal rocked England's nobility, one that mixed prophecy, politics, and the pervasive fear of witchcraft. Eleanor Cobham, Duchess of Gloucester, was no ordinary noblewoman. Wife to Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester and uncle to King Henry VI, she moved in the highest circles of power. But in 1441, her world collapsed when she was dragged into court, accused of conspiring with astrologers and witches to predict the king's death. This wasn't just gossip, it was a charge that carried the weight of treason, and it revealed just how dangerous it was to whisper about the future in medieval England. The accusations against Eleanor were bizarre even for their time. Her alleged crimes included hiring sorcerers to craft a wax effigy of Henry VI, melting it to bring about his demise. Witnesses claimed she'd sought out prophecies about the king's health and the stability of his reign, a fatal mistake in an era where foresight was often conflated with treason. But peek beneath the surface and the trial reeks of political sabotage. Eleanor's husband, Humphrey, was Henry's heir presumptive, a man whose ambition made him enemies in court. By targeting Eleanor, his rivals struck at him indirectly, using her supposed dabbling in the occult to taint his reputation and weaken his claim. What makes Eleanor's story so chilling isn't just the allegations, it's how quickly prophecy became a weapon. Medieval rulers lived in terror of astrological predictions, believing the stars could sow rebellion or undermine their divine right to rule. When Eleanor's confidants, like the notorious astrologer Roger Bolingbroke, were forced to confess under torture, their revelations fed a narrative of conspiracy that the crown couldn't ignore. Yet modern historians note the glaring inconsistencies in the case. The wax effigy was never produced as evidence, and many of the witnesses had clear motives to lie. Eleanor's punishment was as symbolic as it was severe. Forced to perform public penance walking barefoot through London streets in a white sheet, she was then imprisoned for life, her titles stripped away. Her husband's political influence crumbled soon after, proving how effective the smear campaign had been. But here's the haunting question: was Eleanor truly a scheming witch, or just a pawn in a game where power brokers used superstition to silence threats? Her trial set a precedent, showing how easily accusations of the occult could destroy even the highest born. And in a war where dynasties rose and fell on whispers, that lesson wouldn't be forgotten. Margaret of Anjou was supposed to fade into obscurity after the Yorkists seized power, exiled, widowed, her cause seemingly lost. Yet this formidable queen refused to vanish quietly from history. Her later years read like a medieval thriller packed with daring escapes, coded messages, and whispers of a woman pulling strings from the shadows. After her husband Henry VI's murder in the Tower and her son's death at Tewkesbury, Margaret became a ghost haunting the edges of the Wars of the Roses, her true influence shrouded in rumor and intrigue. Captured by Edward IV's forces in 1471, she was paraded through London as a broken trophy before being ransomed back to France. But here's where the mystery deepens. Contemporary accounts describe her living in poverty under her father's care, yet persistent legends claim she secretly funneled money and agents to Lancastrian loyalists. One tantalizing story tells of her disguising herself as a peasant to slip past guards, boarding a ship to Brittany where she allegedly met with disaffected nobles plotting Edward's downfall. No hard evidence survives, but the timing is suspicious. Just months later, the Duke of Brittany began sheltering Henry Tudor, the future Henry VII, whose claim Margaret vigorously supported. Coincidence or the hand of a master strategist? Even more puzzling is the conflicting portrayal of her final years. Official records paint her as a recluse, grieving and penniless. But diplomatic correspondence from the period hints at something darker. The Milanese ambassador wrote of certain ladies influencing French policy against England, while Burgundian spies reported secret letters carried by merchants between Anjou and Welsh rebels. Was Margaret truly as powerless as Yorkist chroniclers claimed, or did she quietly help lay the groundwork for the Tudor ascent? The truth may lie somewhere in between. Margaret was undeniably broken by her losses, yet her lifelong defiance suggests she never fully abandoned the fight. When Henry Tudor finally triumphed at Bosworth, he honored her with a state funeral, an odd gesture for a supposedly irrelevant exile unless her legacy held unspoken significance. Perhaps her greatest weapon wasn't armies or gold, but the enduring myth of the she-wolf of France, a symbol that kept Lancastrian hope alive long after her death. In the end, Margaret's story reminds us that in the Wars of the Roses, even those written off by history often had one last move to make. Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, wasn't just a player in the Wars of the Roses, he was the board on which the game was set. Known as the Kingmaker for his uncanny ability to raise kings up and tear them down, his influence was so vast that men whispered he held more power than the crown itself. Yet on that fog-choked morning at Barnet in 1471, Warwick's luck ran out in the most brutal, bewildering way possible. His death wasn't just another casualty of war, it was the moment the entire conflict pivoted, leaving historians to debate whether it was sheer misfortune, treachery, or something far more calculated that ended his reign as England's puppet master. The official account paints a picture of battlefield chaos. Warwick, fighting on foot after his horse was killed, found himself isolated in the thick mist, his forces crumbling under the weight of their own confusion. When Yorkist soldiers finally surrounded him, the man who'd orchestrated the rise and fall of kings died like any common foot soldier. Stabbed in the back, his armor stripped, his body left naked in the mud. But peel back the layers and the story grows murkier. Why was Warwick, a seasoned commander, caught so unprepared? Why did his closest allies fail to rally to his defense? And why did Edward IV, the king he'd betrayed and then briefly reconciled with, refuse to grant his corpse the dignity of a public display? Theories of betrayal swirl like the Barnet fog itself. Some point to Warwick's own brother, John Neville, who defected to Edward's side months earlier. Was his absence from Warwick's flank at the critical moment deliberate? Others suspect George, Duke of Clarence, Warwick's slippery son-in-law, who'd famously switched allegiances twice before. Clarence had everything to gain from Warwick's death, inheriting his vast estates and influence overnight. Then there's the eerie detail of Warwick's final words, reportedly begging for Clarence's help as the blades fell. Was it a plea or an accusation? Warwick's legacy is as tangled as his demise. His death didn't just remove a key Lancastrian leader, it shattered an entire system of power. The nobility had relied on his patronage, the common folk saw him as a larger-than-life figure who could challenge royal overreach. Without him, the Lancastrian cause floundered, paving the way for Edward's firm grip on the throne, at least until the next player, Henry Tudor, emerged from the shadows. But perhaps the most haunting question isn't how Warwick died, but what his death reveals about the Wars of the Roses itself. A conflict where even the mightiest could vanish in an instant, where loyalty was currency, and where the line between hero and villain was written by the victors in blood. Edward IV's reign glittered with gold, but not all of it was honorably earned. Behind his victories and lavish court lay a shadowy tale of plundered wealth, whispered curses, and a fortune so tainted by betrayal that men claimed it carried a deadly price. From the moment he seized the throne in 1461, Edward faced accusations of hoarding treasures through ruthless means, confiscating estates, extorting loans from merchants, and even looting the tombs of his own ancestors. But the most damning rumors swirled around one particular trove, the legendary fortune of the Lancastrian loyalists stripped from their dead hands after the Battle of Towton. This wasn't just spoils of war, it was blood money, and superstition clung to it like cobwebs. Witnesses spoke of chests overflowing with gold plate, jeweled reliquaries, and sacks of coins stamped with the faces of dead kings, all hauled away to Edward's secret chambers. Yet those who handled the treasure reportedly met grim fates. His treasurer, Thomas Vaughan, was executed without trial by Richard III years later. William Hastings, the king's closest friend, lost his head in a shocking purge. Even Edward's own brother, George of Clarence, drowned in a barrel of Malmsey wine after being accused of treason. Coincidence? Contemporary chroniclers thought not. They wrote of a Lancastrian curse haunting the Yorkist coffers, punishing those who profited from stolen fortunes. The mystery deepens with the persistent legend of Edward's hidden hoard. On his deathbed, he allegedly ordered his gold concealed not in the Tower, but in the watery marshes of East Anglia or beneath the foundations of a remote abbey. Treasure hunters have scoured these sites for centuries, spurred by cryptic references in medieval ledgers. In the 1800s, labourers near Fotheringhay Castle claimed to unearth a chest of gold nobles before the ground inexplicably collapsed, swallowing both the find and one of the diggers. Was it a tragic accident or something more sinister? Modern historians offer a pragmatic explanation. Edward's cursed gold was likely melted down to fund his wars or dispersed among his creditors. But the lingering superstition reveals a deeper truth about the Wars of the Roses. In an age where divine favor was as crucial as military might, wealth seized through bloodshed carried a moral stain. Whether real or imagined, the curse of Edward's treasure became a weapon in itself. A story told to justify rebellions, explain misfortunes, and remind the powerful that not even kings could escape the consequences of their greed. In the chaotic aftermath of Bosworth, when the Tudor grip on England was still fragile, a strange rumor began to spread, a whisper that one of the lost Plantagenet princes had somehow survived. Not Edward V or his brother Richard, but their cousin, young Edward Plantagenet, Earl of Warwick, the last direct male heir of the Yorkist line. The boy was supposed to be locked securely in the Tower under Henry VII's watch. Yet by 1487, a 10-year-old child named Lambert Simnel was being paraded through Ireland, crowned as King Edward VI, with a circlet stolen from a statue of the Virgin Mary. How did this penniless baker's son become the figurehead of a rebellion that nearly toppled the Tudors before their reign truly began? The answer lies in the shadowy network of Yorkist loyalists who refused to accept defeat. Simnel's rise was no accident. It was an audacious propaganda operation masterminded by a rogue priest named Richard Simmons. Spotting the boy's uncanny resemblance to the young Warwick, Simmons groomed him for the role, teaching him courtly manners and the family's secret histories. But the real power behind the plot was John de la Pole, Earl of Lincoln, Richard III's chosen heir. Lincoln knew Warwick was imprisoned in London, yet he cynically promoted Simnel's claim, rallying disaffected nobles and foreign mercenaries to the cause. The stakes were staggering. If successful, they could erase Henry's victory with a single stroke. Their boldest move came when Simnel's supporters convinced Margaret of Burgundy, sister of Edward IV and Richard III, to recognize him as her nephew. Margaret funded an army of 2,000 German and Irish soldiers, landing them in England under the banner of the White Rose. At the Battle of Stokefield in 1487, the fate of the Tudor dynasty hung by a thread. Henry's forces prevailed, but the brutality of the fighting, where German pikemen reportedly fought to the last man, revealed just how close England had come to slipping back into civil war. Here's where the mystery deepens. After crushing the rebellion, Henry did something astonishing. He spared Simnel. The boy was put to work in the royal kitchens, turning spits and scrubbing pots. Some historians argue this was a calculated act of mercy to undermine future pretenders. Why martyr a pawn when you could expose him as a fraud? Others suspect darker motives. Simnel's later life as a loyal servant suggests he may have been coerced into silence, perhaps even confirming Warwick's imprisonment to discredit future claimants. The strangest twist: decades later, another pretender, Perkin Warbeck, would emerge claiming to be Richard of York, and some whispered that Simnel, now a middle-aged falconer, was quietly consulted to debunk him. The baker's boy turned king turned kitchen hand had become an unwitting weapon in Henry's propaganda machine. His story blurs the line between deception and desperation, reminding us that in the Wars of the Roses, even the most improbable survivors could rewrite history from the shadows. Tewkesbury Abbey stands as one of England's most haunted battlefields, its ancient stones soaked in the echoes of a massacre. On the 4th of May 1471, the fields around this medieval church became a slaughterhouse for the Lancastrian forces, a defeat so crushing it ended their cause for good. But what makes this site unique isn't just the bloodshed. It's the persistent legends that the dead never truly left. Visitors and monks alike have reported unearthly screams echoing through the cloisters at dawn, shadows moving against the light, and the overwhelming scent of iron and sweat in the air, as if the battle still rages just beyond sight. The most infamous phenomenon is Bloody Meadow, the patch of ground where Lancastrian soldiers were cut down as they fled toward the River Severn. Locals swear the grass grows unnaturally red in certain spots, even when no drought or disease could explain it. In the 18th century, a farmer plowing the field claimed his horses reared up at invisible obstacles, their hooves striking something hard, except the soil was freshly turned. Later excavations uncovered a mass grave, the skeletons tangled in the poses of men who died mid-run. But the eeriest accounts come from modern visitors who have felt sudden, inexplicable chills in broad daylight or heard the distinct clatter of sword against shield when no one else was around. Then there's the Weeping Knight, a spectral figure seen kneeling before the abbey's high altar, his armor dripping with water or blood. Some believe he's Edward of Westminster, the Lancastrian prince slain at 17, denied last rites in the chaos. Others think he's one of the desperate soldiers who sought sanctuary inside the church, only for the Yorkists to break ancient custom and drag them out for execution. The abbey's records mention a mysterious dampness that reappears on certain stones, no matter how often they're cleaned. During renovations in the 1920s, workers uncovered a medieval sword embedded in the wall behind the altar, its blade rusted as if submerged for centuries. Was it hidden there by a dying man, or does it mark the spot where the killing spilled into sacred ground? Science offers little comfort to skeptics. Geologists point to iron-rich groundwater that might discolor the meadow, while psychologists suggest the power of suggestion in a place steeped in grim history. Yet even the most rational observers admit there's something unsettling about Tewkesbury at twilight, when the shadows stretch long and the wind sounds almost like voices. Perhaps the ghosts aren't supernatural at all, but fragments of memory, the land itself refusing to forget the screams, the prayers, and the moment a dynasty died in the mud. Whatever the truth, the abbey stands as a reminder that some wounds never fully heal. They just wait, silent and patient, for someone to listen. The story of Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville isn't just a royal romance, it's a political earthquake dressed in velvet. Picture this, the year is 1464, and England's newly crowned Yorkist king, fresh off battlefield victories, encounters a widow kneeling by the roadside, pleading for her confiscated land. Elizabeth Grey, née Woodville, was no ordinary petitioner. Beautiful, sharp-witted, and from a family of ambitious Lancastrians, she should have been the last woman Edward would ever marry. Yet by May of that year, they'd exchanged vows in a secret ceremony so hushed, even the king's closest advisors were kept in the dark. This wasn't just a scandal, it was a dynastic grenade rolled into the heart of English politics. At first glance, the match seems like sheer reckless passion. Edward could have wed any princess of Europe to secure alliances, but he chose a woman 5 years his senior, with 2 children from a previous marriage and a family tainted by ties to his enemies. But look closer and the strategy reveals itself. The Woodvilles weren't just Lancastrian sympathizers, they were exceptionally well connected. Elizabeth's mother, Jacquetta of Luxembourg, was a force in her own right, descended from European royalty and rumored to possess knowledge of the occult. Marrying Elizabeth bound these networks to Edward, giving him access to vast estates, covert loyalists, and a web of influence that stretched across the Channel. The backlash was immediate and venomous. When the marriage finally came to light, Edward's own mentor, the Earl of Warwick, the very man who'd put him on the throne, was furious. Warwick had been negotiating a French bride for the king, and this secret wedding made him look like a fool. Worse, Edward began elevating the Woodvilles at breakneck speed. Elizabeth's brother Anthony became Lord Scales, her sisters married into noble families, and her father was made Earl Rivers. To the old aristocracy, it smelled of a coup. The king wasn't just favoring his in-laws, he was reshaping the power structure of England right under their noses. This is where Richard III's later claim of illegitimacy takes root. When Edward died unexpectedly in 1483, leaving two young sons as heirs, Richard seized on lingering doubts about the marriage's validity. He argued the union had been conducted without witnesses, possibly under duress, or worse, that Edward had been enchanted by Jacquetta's sorcery. Some chroniclers even whispered of a prior betrothal between Edward and another woman, which would have rendered his marriage to Elizabeth null. Whether Richard truly believed these claims or simply weaponized them is still debated, but the effect was devastating. By casting doubt on the prince's legitimacy, he justified his own seizure of the throne. Yet the most intriguing question isn't about legality, it's about loyalty. Despite the risks, Edward never repudiated Elizabeth or their children. Even when Warwick rebelled and briefly restored Henry VI in 1470, Edward fought his way back to power for his family. That stubborn devotion suggests something deeper than political calculation. Perhaps the secret marriage was both love and strategy, a king gambling that a controversial queen with sharp instincts was worth more than any foreign alliance. In the end, the Woodville marriage didn't just fuel Richard's ambitions. It redefined what it meant to rule, proving that in the Wars of the Roses, even the heart could be a weapon. The alleged precontract between Edward IV and Eleanor Talbot is one of history's most convenient accusations, a shadowy claim that reshaped the future of England with a single stroke of Richard III's pen. According to Tudor chroniclers, before Edward married Elizabeth Woodville, he had secretly pledged himself to Eleanor, daughter of the Earl of Shrewsbury. If true, this would render his later marriage invalid and his children illegitimate, stripping the young princes of their birthright. But was this a genuine legal obstacle, or a masterstroke of political theatre designed to clear Richard's path to the throne? Eleanor Talbot, also known as Eleanor Butler, was a noblewoman from a respected Lancastrian family. By the time Richard resurrected the precontract story in 1483, she'd been dead for years, silent and unable to defend herself. The sole witness to this alleged betrothal was Robert Stillington, Bishop of Bath and Wells, a man with a checkered past and a history of shifting loyalties. Stillington claimed to have officiated at the secret ceremony, yet no documentation survives, and contemporaries noted his sudden rise in favor under Richard's reign. Conveniently, his testimony emerged just as Richard needed to justify seizing power from his nephews. The timing alone raises eyebrows. The precontract wasn't mentioned during Edward's lifetime, not even when Warwick the Kingmaker rebelled and temporarily restored Henry VI. If Edward's marriage to Elizabeth was truly invalid, why didn't Warwick, desperate to undermine the king, leverage this explosive claim? Even more suspicious, Richard initially swore loyalty to his nephew Edward V, only pivoting to the precontract argument weeks later when it became clear the Woodvilles wouldn't surrender control quietly. It's almost as if the story was crafted precisely when it became politically useful. But let's play devil's advocate. Medieval betrothals weren't casual promises, they were legally binding, sometimes requiring nothing more than a verbal exchange before witnesses. Edward, known for his impulsiveness, might have made such a vow in his youth. Eleanor's family had ties to the Lancastrian cause, making her a strategic match before Edward's Yorkist victory. Yet if this pre-contract existed, why did Eleanor never assert her status as queen? Why no appeals to the church or demands for recognition? Her silent acceptance strains credibility. The most damning evidence against Richard's narrative lies in the reactions of those who knew Edward best. Elizabeth Woodville, fiercely protective of her children's rights, never publicly conceded the pre-contract's validity even after her sons vanished. Foreign courts, usually quick to exploit English instability, treated the claim with skepticism. And then there's the curious fate of Stillington himself. After Richard's fall, Henry VII imprisoned the bishop, suggesting his testimony was either fabricated or coerced. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in the murky middle. Edward might have made vague promises to Eleanor, as was common in noble courtship, without formalizing a binding contract. Richard, seizing on whispers, inflated these rumors into a legal crisis. In an era without DNA tests or marriage certificates, perception was power. By casting doubt, Richard didn't need to prove the pre-contract. He just needed enough uncertainty to make his coup palatable. The pre-contract theory's legacy isn't just about royal lineage. It's a case study in how truth bends to power. Whether fact or fabrication, this claim didn't just alter succession. It doomed two boys to the Tower and set the stage for one of history's most infamous reigns. And that's the real tragedy. In the Wars of the Roses, sometimes the most dangerous weapons weren't swords but stories. George Plantagenet, Duke of Clarence, didn't just die. He drowned in a barrel of his favorite wine, a fate so bizarre it sounds like something from a black comedy rather than the annals of English history. The official story goes like this. Convicted of treason against his own brother, Edward IV, in February 1478, Clarence was granted the privilege of a private execution, no public spectacle, no axe on the scaffold. Instead, the story claims he was left alone in his cell with a cask of Malmsey wine, a sweet Portuguese vintage he famously adored. By morning, he was dead inside it. But was this a macabre act of royal mercy or something far darker? The roots of Clarence's downfall stretch back to his restless ambition. Once Edward's staunchest ally, he'd grown disillusioned, convinced his brother was favoring their other sibling, Richard of Gloucester, the future Richard III. Clarence's discontent boiled over into reckless plots, including an alleged scheme to use necromancy to predict the king's death. But the breaking point came when he openly defied Edward by executing one of his own servants without trial, a brazen challenge to royal authority. The king, fed up with his brother's volatility, had him arrested and pushed through a swift conviction in a parliament stacked with loyalists. Yet the circumstances surrounding Clarence's death reek of political theatre. Why Malmsey, of all things? Some historians suggest it was a cruel joke the wine he loved turned into his coffin. Others argue it was a coded message to the nobility. Even the highest born could be erased without a trace. Then there's the persistent rumor that Clarence wasn't executed at all, that he'd already been secretly killed days earlier, and the wine barrel story was concocted to spare Edward the stigma of fratricide. Clarence's mental state adds another layer of mystery. Contemporary accounts describe him as increasingly erratic, prone to outbursts and paranoid delusions. Was he truly unhinged, or was this a narrative carefully crafted to justify his removal? His own wife, Isabella Neville, had died under suspicious circumstances years earlier, fueling theories that Clarence himself might have been poisoned, slowly driven mad to discredit him. The most chilling possibility is that Clarence knew too much. As Edward's former heir presumptive, he'd been privy to the family's darkest secrets, from the truth about Elizabeth Woodville's marriage to the fate of the Lancastrian prisoners after Tewkesbury. If Clarence had threatened to expose these truths, silencing him wouldn't just be convenient, it would be necessary. What makes Clarence's end so haunting isn't just the method, it's the silence that followed. Edward never spoke of it again, and Richard, who'd initially defended Clarence, later benefited enormously from his absence. Even Shakespeare, writing a century later, couldn't resist the dramatic irony. in Richard III, Clarence dreams of drowning before his murderers arrive. History remembers him as a cautionary tale. In the Wars of the Roses, even princes weren't safe from the tides of betrayal, especially when they swam too close to the throne. Henry Tudor's survival reads like something out of a spy novel, a fugitive teenager dodging assassins, fleeing through stormy seas, and relying on sheer luck to stay one step ahead of the Yorkist forces determined to wipe out the last flicker of the Lancastrian line. By 1471, with the Lancastrian cause in ruins after Tewkesbury, 14-year-old Henry was the sole remaining male claimant with even a whisper of royal blood. That made him a marked man. So began a 14-year exile where every shadow could hide a knife, every friendly face might be a traitor, and the difference between survival and a dagger in the dark often came down to the whims of foreign princes. His first close call came in Brittany, where he'd fled with his uncle Jasper Tudor. Edward IV, sensing the threat, tried to bribe Duke Francis II to hand Henry over, offering a fortune in wool and silver. The Duke hesitated, but his treasurer Pierre Landais nearly sold Henry out in secret. At the last moment, Henry feigned illness, collapsing dramatically in the courtyard as guards arrived to seize him. Whether it was genuine or a ruse, the delay bought time for Breton nobles loyal to the Duke to intervene, spiriting Henry away to a remote fortress. That pattern would repeat for years, Edward's spies circling, Henry's protectors wavering, and fate intervening just in time. The most audacious escape came in 1484, when Henry was nearly kidnapped by Yorkist agents posing as merchants. Disguised as a groom, he slipped out of a tavern's back door moments before the trap closed, galloping bareback to sanctuary in a nearby church. What's staggering isn't just the near misses, it's how many powerful players gambled on him. Margaret Beaufort, Henry's formidable mother, funneled money through a network of English nuns. In France, Anne of Beaujeu, regent for the young King Charles VIII, saw Henry as a pawn to weaken England. Even the Scottish court briefly harbored him, though they later traded his location for a Yorkist prisoner. Yet the true turning point was Richard III's own missteps. When Richard seized the throne in 1483, his crackdown on former allies, like the shocking execution of Lord Hastings, drove disaffected Yorkists into Henry's arms. Men like the Stanley family, who'd once served Edward loyally, now whispered promises of support. Then came the final stroke of fortune. In 1485, a rebellion within Brittany forced Duke Francis to release Henry to French custody. Paris became his springboard. The French crown, eager to destabilize Richard, funded ships and mercenaries. Henry's survival wasn't just luck, it was a masterclass in turning vulnerability into strength. Every failed assassination taught him secrecy. Every broken promise honed his knack for reading allies. By the time he landed at Milford Haven in 1485 to challenge Richard at Bosworth, he'd spent half his life surviving plots. The twist: Richard's own desperation to kill him had created the very coalition that destroyed him. The boy who'd once fled through back alleys now marched under the dragon banner of Cadwallader, a symbol of Welsh destiny. Proof that in the Wars of the Roses, sometimes the greatest power lay not in armies but in outlasting your enemies. By the winter of 1462, Margaret of Anjou was a queen without a kingdom, her husband imprisoned, her son's inheritance stolen, and her armies scattered after the Yorkist victories. Yet in her darkest hour, she scribbled a desperate plea on parchment, sealed it with trembling hands, and sent it north to the court of James III of Scotland. This wasn't just a letter, it was a secret cry for salvation, laced with coded language and veiled threats. The document survives today, its ink faded but its urgency still palpable. Within its lines lies a mystery. Was this the last gasp of a doomed cause, or part of a wider web of intrigue that might have changed history? At first glance, the letter reads like a straightforward appeal. Margaret addresses James as dearest cousin, invoking their shared ancestry through the House of Beaufort. she describes Henry VI's captivity as an unholy trespass against God's anointed and begs for Scottish troops to restore rightful order. But between the lines, something more cunning emerges. References to the Falcon's Flight and the Thorned Rose mirror known Lancastrian ciphers, likely allusions to hidden allies or planned uprisings. Most chilling is her mention of debts owed, a possible nod to rumors that James's father had accepted Lancastrian gold during earlier conflicts. Was this a request or a barely veiled blackmail? The Scottish response, or lack thereof, deepens the puzzle. James, only 10 years old at the time, was under the regency of his mother, Mary of Guelders. Court records show the letter was received, yet no official reply survives. Oddly, just months later, Scottish forces began harassing Yorkist-held border towns, coinciding with Margaret's own guerrilla campaigns in northern England. Coincidence or proof of a silent pact? Some historians point to a sudden influx of French money into Scottish coffers that year, funds that could have been funneled through Margaret's relatives in Anjou. Others argue the Scots were merely exploiting England's chaos for their own gain, with no real intent to restore Henry. Then there's the letter's most haunting passage, a warning that those who feast with crows may find their own eyes plucked. Was this a threat against James's own nobles, some of whom had Yorkist sympathies, or a prophecy of the Warwick-led rebellions to come? The ambiguity is deliberate. Margaret, ever the strategist, knew words could be weapons. By leaving her meaning just opaque enough, she gave James plausible deniability while signaling her resolve to allies. The true impact of this letter may lie in what it reveals about Margaret's network. Even in exile, she maintained channels to foreign courts, leveraging every drop of royal blood and every old alliance. That she chose Scotland, a kingdom itself riven by faction, suggests she understood power's shifting sands better than her enemies credited. The letter didn't save Lancaster's cause, but it stands as a testament to a queen who refused to surrender even when the world had counted her out. And that, perhaps, is the real mystery. How close did she come to turning the tide with nothing but ink, parchment, and sheer, unyielding will? On a quiet morning in 1996, construction workers near the village of Towton stumbled upon something that had lain hidden for over 500 years, a tangled mass of bones just beneath the surface of a farmer's field. At first glance, it might have seemed like an ordinary archaeological find, but what they uncovered was far more chilling. These were the remains of soldiers who'd fought in one of the bloodiest battles ever fought on English soil, the Battle of Towton, Palm Sunday, 1461. Forensic analysis would later reveal wounds so brutal they defied imagination. Skulls split clean in half by poleaxes, spines shattered by warhammers, and even one man whose face had been methodically sliced off before death. This wasn't just a battlefield, it was a killing field where the rules of war had been abandoned in favor of sheer annihilation. What makes Towton unique isn't just the scale of the slaughter. Estimates suggest 28,000 men died that day, in a country with a population barely touching 2 million. But the forensic snapshot it provides of medieval combat. The skeletons tell stories no chronicler could. One man, barely in his 20s, bore the marks of 16 separate injuries, his bones chipped and hacked like a butcher's block. Another had his hands crossed over his chest in a futile attempt to shield himself from the final blow. Most haunting of all was the presence of so-called execution wounds, precise cuts to the neck and back of the skull, evidence that wounded Lancastrians had been systematically dispatched after the battle. These weren't just casualties, they were victims of a calculated purge, yet the real mystery lies in the unanswered questions. Why were so many bodies left unburied for weeks, allowing carrion birds and scavengers to scatter them? Why did some have coins or makeshift talismans tucked into their clothing, as if they'd known they wouldn't survive? And most puzzling of all, why were a handful of corpses found miles from the battlefield, some with their teeth filed into points? Folk legends whispered of nightwalkers, undead warriors cursed to roam, but modern researchers offer a darker theory. The filed teeth may have been the mark of mercenaries, foreign killers hired for their ruthlessness, their grotesque grins meant to terrify the enemy. Totem's dead force us to confront the Wars of the Roses not as a romantic tapestry of knights and chivalry, but as a descent into total war. The battle itself was a microcosm of the conflict's savagery, fought in a blizzard with men slipping on their own comrades' blood, drowning in frozen streams under the weight of their armor. When the snow finally melted, the Lancastrian line had been erased, not just defeated, but exterminated. The Yorkist victory was so absolute that Edward IV marched straight to London and claimed the crown. But the bones beneath Totem whisper a cautionary tale. In this war, no triumph came without a river of blood, and no grave could ever truly silence the screams of the fallen. The night before the Battle of Bosworth, according to chroniclers of the time, King Richard III woke in a cold sweat, his tent eerily silent except for the pounding of his own heart. He'd dreamed of shadowy figures crowding around him, ghosts, some said, of those he'd wronged, whispering curses as they reached for his crown. This wasn't just a bad dream. To a medieval mind, it was a dire prophecy, a message from God or the devil himself. The fact that these accounts survived, meticulously recorded by Tudor historians, adds another layer of intrigue. Were these visions real, exaggerated, or perhaps invented after the fact to paint Richard as a man haunted by his own sins? Medieval Europe took dreams deadly seriously. They weren't just random firings of the brain, they were coded messages, divine warnings, or even demonic traps. Kings consulted astrologers and mystic advisors to interpret their nightmares, believing a single dream could foretell victory or doom. Richard, a man deeply versed in the piety and superstitions of his age, would have seen these apparitions as more than mere night terrors. The timing alone would have chilled him. On the eve of a battle where his rival, Henry Tudor, marched under the banner of the mythical Welsh dragon, a symbol of destiny. To Richard's contemporaries, the dream's meaning was obvious. He was being judged, and the verdict was death. Modern psychology offers a different lens. Sleep disturbances before major life events, especially ones involving extreme stress, are well documented. Richard, known to suffer from chronic pain likely caused by scoliosis, may have experienced heightened parasomnia due to physical discomfort and anxiety. The reported ghosts could easily be manifestations of guilt or trauma, his subconscious conjuring faces of those who died during his rise to power. His nephews, his brother Clarence, even his former ally Lord Hastings, executed without trial. This doesn't mean Richard confessed to anything in waking life, only that the human mind under siege can turn shadows into specters. Yet the most fascinating question isn't whether the dream happened, but why it was remembered. Tudor propagandists had every reason to frame Richard as a tormented villain, his conscience devouring him on the brink of battle. Shakespeare immortalized the scene in Richard III with the king crying out, "O coward conscience, how dost thou afflict me?" But dig deeper and you find quieter, more ambiguous accounts. Some Lancastrian sources claim Richard emerged from his tent pale but resolute, ordering his priests to say extra masses. Others suggest the dream was a later invention, stitched into the historical record to give moral weight to Henry's victory. Perhaps the truth lies in the collision of two worlds, the medieval, where dreams held cosmic significance, and the modern, where we dissect them as neurons and stress hormones. Either way, the story of Richard's last night captures something essential about the Wars of the Roses, a time when the boundaries between the real and the supernatural were porous, when kings could be undone as easily by a nightmare as by a sword stroke. And in that grey dawn before Bosworth, as Richard armored himself for a battle he'd lose before sunset, the past and the future must have felt equally alive in the trembling air. Edward IV's death in April 1483 should have been a straightforward transition of power. His 12-year-old son, Edward V, was the undisputed heir, and the kingdom had known peace for over a decade. But within weeks of the king's passing, chaos erupted. The boy king was intercepted by his uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester, on his way to London for coronation. By June, Parliament declared Edward and his siblings illegitimate, clearing the path for Richard to seize the throne as Richard III. At the heart of this power grab lay a tantalizing mystery: the vanishing of Edward IV's last will and testament, a document that might have held the key to preventing the bloodshed that followed. The will's disappearance wasn't just unfortunate, it was suspiciously convenient. Medieval kings didn't die without leaving explicit instructions, especially not a ruler as shrewd as Edward. His final wishes would have detailed everything from funeral arrangements to the guardianship of his children. Most critically, it likely named a regency council to govern until young Edward came of age, a council that almost certainly wouldn't have included Richard in a dominant role. Yet when the king's inner circle gathered after his death, the will was nowhere to be found. The only surviving fragment, a vague reference in a letter from the French diplomat Philippe de Comines, who claimed Edward had secretly revised his will months earlier, possibly under pressure from hostile nobles. If true, that revision could have contained explosive provisions, perhaps even preemptively stripping Richard of influence, so who stood to gain from its destruction? Richard's allies had motive. The Woodvilles, the family of Edward's queen, were the obvious regents, and Richard's coup hinged on sidelining them. Without the will's constraints, he could argue that the Woodvilles were plotting to control the boy king, a narrative he weaponized to justify taking custody of Edward V and his brother. But the Woodvilles weren't the only players. Edward's longtime friend William Hastings, who initially supported Richard, was abruptly executed weeks later. Had Hastings known the will's contents, or worse, had he hidden it? Then there's the curious case of Thomas Rotherham, Archbishop of York, who allegedly stole the Great Seal of England in a botched attempt to secure the will. Was he trying to protect it or suppress it? Even Elizabeth Woodville's actions raise questions. After surrendering her younger son to Richard, she fled to sanctuary, a move that suggests she knew the rules of succession had been upended. Did she fear the will's provisions had been twisted, or that its absence left her children vulnerable? The most haunting possibility is that the will didn't vanish, it was deliberately altered. Medieval wills were fluid. Kings could amend them orally on their deathbeds, leaving room for interpretation by those present. If Edward, gravely ill, had whispered last-minute changes, who's to say those words weren't edited by the men who stood to profit? Richard's later claim that Edward's marriage to Elizabeth was invalid, making their children bastards, reeks of retroactive justification. Without the original will to contradict him, he could rewrite history with impunity. 5 centuries later, the loss of this document remains one of history's great what-ifs. Would it have named a regency council strong enough to block Richard? Could it have prevented the prince's disappearance? We'll never know, and that's precisely what makes its absence so devastating. In the Wars of the Roses, paper was as powerful as steel, and sometimes the most consequential battles were fought not on fields but in the silent spaces between missing words. Edward IV's final days were a masterclass in how quickly fortune could turn in medieval England. In the spring of 1483, the king was a towering figure, only 40 years old, seemingly in robust health and fresh from another hunting trip. Then, without warning, he collapsed. Within weeks, he was dead. The shock reverberated through the kingdom like a thunderclap because Edward wasn't just any monarch. He was the linchpin holding a fragile peace together. His sudden demise didn't just leave a throne vacant, it lit the fuse for one of history's most infamous power struggles. Contemporary accounts describe his illness with frustrating vagueness. Some chroniclers mention a fit of apoplexy, a catch-all term for sudden collapse. Others whisper of a burning fever, his body racked by chills and sweats. The most tantalizing clue comes from a French diplomat who wrote that Edward succumbed after eating a dish of cold cherries, a detail that sparked centuries of speculation. Was it poison, an allergic reaction, or just a tragic coincidence? The timing alone invites suspicion. Edward had recently reconciled with his brother Clarence's allies, men who might have held grudges. Then there's the shadow of France. Louis XI, ever the opportunist, had reason to destabilize England by removing its most formidable king. But poison isn't the only possibility. Modern medical historians suggest everything from pneumonia to a stroke, exacerbated by Edward's notorious lifestyle. This was a man who feasted relentlessly, drank heavily, and had grown so overweight in his later years that his armor had to be let out repeatedly. Stress, too, could have played a role. The last year of his reign had been fraught. Rebellions simmered in the north, the treasury was stretched thin from war, and his alliance with Burgundy was crumbling. Even the sturdiest ruler might buckle under such strain. The real mystery isn't just how Edward died, it's how his death exposed the cracks in Yorkist rule. For 12 years, he'd governed with a mix of charisma and calculated ruthlessness, balancing factions like a master puppeteer. But he'd made one critical miscalculation, assuming his young son could inherit that same control. Without Edward's commanding presence, the Woodvilles and Richard of Gloucester circled each other like wolves, their feud escalating into open war within months. Perhaps the most haunting question is whether Edward saw the storm coming. In his final days, he reportedly amended his will, though its contents vanished mysteriously. Did he suspect his brother's ambition? Did he grasp how flimsy peace could be without him? His death wasn't just the end of a king, it was the moment the Wars of the Roses, seemingly settled, roared back to life with a vengeance. And in that chaos, two boys would vanish into the tower, a crown would be stolen, and a dynasty would fall. All because a man in his prime took a bite of fruit and never woke up. In the autumn of 1491, a young man stepped onto the shores of Ireland, his face pale with the gravity of his own claim. He declared himself Richard of Shrewsbury, Duke of York, the younger of the two princes who'd vanished from the tower over a decade earlier. To the stunned onlookers, he became known as Perkin Warbeck, a name that would ignite rebellions, strain royal marriages, and force Henry VII to confront a nightmare he thought long buried, the possibility that a Plantagenet heir had somehow survived. Warbeck's story was either the most audacious fraud of the century or a miracle straight from the pages of a medieval romance. According to his own account, he'd been spared as a child by a sympathetic guard, smuggled to Flanders, and raised in secrecy by Yorkist loyalists. His supporters pointed to his striking resemblance to Edward IV, his knowledge of courtly customs, and the curious fact that Margaret of Burgundy, sister to Edward and Richard III, recognized him as her nephew almost immediately. She funded his cause, outfitting him with ships and soldiers, while foreign courts hesitated, torn between skepticism and the tantalizing prospect of destabilizing Henry's hard-won throne. Yet cracks in Warbeck's tale emerged under scrutiny. Henry's spies uncovered details suggesting he was actually the son of a Flemish boatman, educated by Yorkist exiles to play the part of a prince. Witnesses described him struggling to recall basic details of royal life, confusing landmarks in the tower, and faltering when asked about childhood events only the real Richard would know. Then there was the timing. His revelation came just as Henry faced growing unrest over high taxes and noble disaffection, making him a convenient figurehead for dissent. Henry's response was characteristically ruthless. After Warbeck's failed invasion of England in 1497 ended with his capture, the king ordered him paraded through London in chains, then confined to the Tower alongside the real Earl of Warwick, a cruel juxtaposition meant to highlight the absurdity of his claim. But Henry didn't stop there. When Warwick and Warbeck were later accused of plotting escape, both were executed, eliminating the last plausible Yorkist threats in one bloody stroke. The enigma lingers. Modern historians note that Warbeck's confession, extracted under duress, reads more like a script than a genuine admission. Some speculate he might have been a pawn, convinced of his own royal birth by those who groomed him. Others wonder if fragments of truth clung to his story. Perhaps he was an illegitimate Plantagenet scion or a distant relative used as a proxy. What's certain is that Henry's panic was palpable. His immediate destruction of all records related to Warbeck's interrogation suggests a king terrified not just of rebellion, but of the questions the pretender's existence raised. In the end, Warbeck's legacy isn't just about identity, it's about power's fragility. That a boatman's son could shake a dynasty reveals how thin the line between royalty and ruin really was. And that Henry, Victor of Bosworth, still trembled at a ghost from the tower proves some shadows never fade, they just wait for the right moment to step back into the light. After the slaughter at Tewkesbury, when the Lancastrian cause lay in ruins and their leaders were dead or fleeing, something priceless vanished from the historical record, the crown jewels of Henry VI. These weren't just ornaments, they were the sacred symbols of royal authority, the very objects that transformed a man into a king during coronation. Their disappearance was more than theft, it was the erasure of legitimacy itself. The last confirmed sighting of Henry's regalia came as his queen, Margaret of Anjou, was captured near a tiny Gloucestershire village days after the battle. Chronicles mention rich trappings being seized by Yorkist soldiers, but the crown, sceptre, and orb, the core of royal power, were never officially accounted for. Edward IV's treasury records show no trace of their surrender, leaving historians to piece together three possible fates: plunder, concealment, or destruction. One theory points to battlefield scavengers. In the chaotic aftermath, with bodies stripped of armor and valuables, opportunistic soldiers might have pocketed smaller pieces like the golden ampulla used for holy oil or the coronation ring. The larger items, like the solid gold crown of St. Edward, would have been harder to hide but not impossible. A single disgruntled Lancastrian knight could have smuggled them away, hoping to preserve relics for a future restoration. More intriguing is the possibility they were deliberately hidden. Local folklore in the West Country tells of a chest buried near the Severn River, guarded by an oath of silence from monks who later took the secret to their graves. In 1821, a farmer near Tewkesbury Abbey reportedly unearthed a golden clasp engraved with fleurs de lis, though it vanished into private hands before scholars could examine it. Were these fragments of a greater treasure scattered to prevent Yorkist seizure? Then there's the darkest scenario: systematic destruction. Edward had every reason to melt them down. By erasing the physical symbols of Henry's reign, he could rewrite history, treating the Lancastrian line as pretenders rather than anointed rulers. Goldsmith's records from the period show a suspicious influx of gold into the London Mint around 1472, enough to suggest the crown might have been reduced to ingots and recoined with Edward's face. The loss wasn't just material, it was psychological. Without the regalia, any future Lancastrian claimant would lack the sacred aura of kingship. When Henry Tudor finally took the throne in 1485, he had to commission entirely new pieces for his coronation, a tacit admission that the old order's relics were gone forever. The missing jewels became ghosts in their own right, silent witnesses to how thoroughly the past could be dismantled when power changed hands. Their absence whispers a chilling lesson. In the Wars of the Roses, even gold could be mortal. Middleham Castle, nestled in the rugged Yorkshire moors, was more than just a fortress to Richard III. It was a home, a sanctuary, and ultimately a place of profound sorrow. Here, in these weathered stone halls, Richard's only legitimate son, Edward of Middleham, drew his last breath in April 1484. The boy was just 10 years old. His death shattered Richard's world, but it also birthed something darker. A legend that the castle itself was cursed, its stones steeped in the grief of a doomed dynasty. Locals still whisper that on certain nights the sound of a child's laughter echoes through the empty courtyards, only to fade into anguished sobs. The tragedy of Edward's death is steeped in eerie coincidence. He died suddenly, with chroniclers describing a swift illness that struck like a bolt from the blue. No fever, no lingering decline, just a vibrant child gone in days. Medieval minds saw divine punishment in such losses. Richard, already dogged by rumors of treachery, now faced murmurs that his own ambition had invoked a curse upon his bloodline. The parallels to other cursed royal children are hard to ignore. Edward IV's two sons vanished in the Tower. Henry VI's heir died violently at Tewkesbury. Even Henry VII would later bury his eldest son, Arthur, at 15. In an age where mortality stalked every nursery, these losses weren't just personal tragedies, they were political earthquakes, interpreted as signs of God's displeasure or the machinations of unseen forces. But Middleham's curse lingers in the details. Richard had lavished attention on his son, securing his appointment as Prince of Wales in a grand ceremony just months before his death. The castle, once a symbol of Yorkist strength, became a mausoleum of hopes. Folk tales sprang up like weeds, a spectral figure seen kneeling by the boy's tomb in the nearby church, a pall of mist that refuses to lift from the castle walls on the anniversary of his passing. Even the castle's later owners, the Neville family, spoke of uneasy dreams, visions of a small hand tugging at bedclothes, or the distant sound of a lullaby sung in a voice no living soul could place. What makes Middleham's lore so haunting isn't just the grief of a father, it's how it mirrors the broader devastation of the Wars of the Roses. In a conflict where dynasties rose and fell like leaves in the wind, the death of an heir wasn't just a private sorrow, it was a crack in the foundation of power. Richard, already suspected of eliminating his nephews, now bore the unbearable weight of being the last Plantagenet heir himself. His son's death left him with nothing to fight for but his own survival, a hollow victory that would crumble at Bosworth barely a year later. Perhaps the real curse wasn't supernatural at all, but the relentless tide of history itself, a reminder that in this brutal Game of Thrones, even love was no shield against fate. Middleham stands today as a ruin, its walls open to the sky, but the whispers remain. They tell of a king who lost everything, a child who never grew old, and a castle that remembers. In the end, the stones outlasted the dynasty, but the echoes of that grief, those, it seems, are forever. Elizabeth Woodville's decision to flee into Westminster Abbey with her daughters in 1483 wasn't just an act of desperation, it was a calculated move in a deadly game. As Richard III seized power and her sons vanished into the Tower, the Queen Dowager made a choice that would fuel speculation for centuries. She sought sanctuary, clutching her younger daughters close as the Abbey's heavy doors swung shut behind them. But what did she truly know? Was this the retreat of a grieving mother helpless to protect her children, or the strategic withdrawal of a woman who understood the stakes better than anyone? Sanctuary wasn't merely a hiding place, it was a sacred firewall against violence. By medieval law, no one could drag her from consecrated ground, not even a king. Yet Elizabeth's actions in those cloistered weeks reveal a mind still at work. She didn't huddle passively in prayer, she negotiated. Through intermediaries, she bargained with Richard, eventually agreeing to release her daughters into his custody in exchange for promises of safety. Some historians see this as surrender, proof she believed her sons were already lost. Others argue it was a gambit. She knew Richard needed her daughters alive to legitimize his reign, and by appearing compliant, she bought time for allies like Margaret Beaufort to rally behind Henry Tudor. The darkest question lingers: when Elizabeth stepped out of sanctuary, did she carry the weight of a terrible secret? Some accounts suggest she'd received word of the prince's deaths through clandestine channels, perhaps from sympathetic Tower guards or her own brother Anthony's network before his execution. If true, her later decision to betroth her eldest daughter to Henry Tudor takes on new meaning. It wasn't just pragmatism, it was vengeance dressed in silk, a mother aligning with the one man who could destroy Richard. Yet contradictions abound. Years later, under Henry's reign, Elizabeth was abruptly stripped of her titles and banished to a nunnery. Was this punishment for knowing too much, a silencing measure to bury her version of events? Or had she, like so many others, become expendable once her usefulness ended? The Abbey's stone walls kept no records of her whispered conversations, but the aftermath speaks volumes. Her sanctuary wasn't an ending, it was the quiet epicenter of a storm where the fate of kingdoms turned on a widow's choices and history wrote its verdict in shadows. Edward Plantagenet, Earl of Warwick, spent more of his life behind bars than in sunlight, a prince by blood, a prisoner by circumstance, and ultimately a pawn in a game he never chose to play. Born the son of George, Duke of Clarence and Isabel Neville, he was just 3 years old when his father met that infamous end in the Malmsey wine barrel. From that moment, Edward's existence became a paradox, too royal to ignore, too dangerous to free. For a boy who never wielded a sword or signed a treaty, his very lineage made him one of the most perilous figures in Tudor England. Henry VII's decision to lock him away in the Tower wasn't just about Edward's claim, it was about the whispers that followed him. As the last direct male heir of the Plantagenet line, he was a living banner for every disaffected Yorkist still dreaming of toppling the Tudors. Yet Henry didn't execute him outright, as he had with so many others. Instead, he kept Edward in a gilded cage, allowing him just enough comfort to avoid martyrdom but never enough freedom to breathe. Visitors described a tall, handsome young man with his father's features, his mind reportedly dulled by years of isolation, whether by nature or design, no one could say. The Tower's records note he was taught basic Latin and music, given fine clothes, even permitted to walk the walls under guard. But these were not kindnesses, they were calculations. A broken prince was less threatening than a dead one. The tragedy lies in what might have been. Edward's sister Margaret, later Countess of Salisbury, became a formidable political player, suggesting the family's intellect hadn't diluted with time. Had Edward been raised at court, educated as the nobleman he was, he might have been a bridge between York and Tudor, but Henry couldn't risk it. Every failed pretender Lambert Simnel, Perkin Warbeck, had invoked Edward's name, proof that his blood alone could ignite rebellion. By the turn of the 16th century, with Henry's grip on the throne still tenuous, the king faced an agonizing choice: continue housing this human time bomb or eliminate the threat for good. The end came with chilling pragmatism. In 1499, a wave of paranoia swept the court after another Yorkist plot surfaced. Edward, now 24, was accused of conspiring with the rebellious Earl of Suffolk, a charge historians widely dismiss as fabricated. The trial was a sham, the verdict a foregone conclusion. On Tower Hill, the last male Plantagenet knelt before an axeman, his death marking the extinction of a dynasty that had ruled England for over 3 centuries. Even then, Henry couldn't resist symbolism. Edward was buried not with pomp but quietly at Bisham Abbey beside the Nevilles, a final insult to his royal blood. What lingers isn't just the injustice, but the haunting question of what Henry truly feared. Was it Edward's potential or the shadow he cast? In a world where kingship was as fragile as parchment, perhaps the greatest threat wasn't a prince's ambition, but the mere possibility he might inspire others. Edward's life, a childhood of confinement, an adulthood of quiet despair, stands as the Wars of the Rose's quietest tragedy. Not a battle lost or a throne seized, but a man who was neither villain nor victim, only a name to be buried with the bones of the past. The Battle of Stokefield in 1487 was meant to be the last gasp of the Wars of the Roses, a final, desperate attempt by die-hard Yorkists to overthrow Henry VII before his Tudor dynasty could take root. Leading the charge was John de la Pole, Earl of Lincoln, a man whose bloodline made him both a formidable claimant and a living contradiction. nephew to both Edward IV and Richard III, he'd initially sworn loyalty to Henry, only to pivot suddenly and champion the cause of Lambert Simnel, the young pretender posing as Edward Plantagenet. But when the fighting ended and the smoke cleared, Lincoln lay dead on the field, his body broken by the relentless Tudor advance. Officially, he fell in combat, cut down like any other soldier. Yet the circumstances of his death raise a darker possibility. Was this battle truly the end of him, or did Henry's regime ensure he'd never rise again? On paper, Lincoln's fate seems straightforward. Chroniclers describe him fighting ferociously in the vanguard, his German mercenaries holding their ground even as the rebel lines crumbled. The sheer brutality of the engagement supports this. Stoke was a slaughterhouse, with thousands falling under a hail of arrows and poleaxe blows. But dig deeper and inconsistencies emerge. Unlike most noble casualties, Lincoln's body wasn't returned to his family for burial. Instead, it vanished into an unmarked grave, a curious fate for a man of his rank. Even stranger, Henry's own accounts of the battle go oddly silent on Lincoln's final moments, glossing over whether he died by a common soldier's hand or something more deliberate. Then there's the matter of timing. Lincoln wasn't just any rebel, he was Richard III's chosen heir, the man who'd been groomed for the throne before Bosworth overturned everything. His survival posed an existential threat to Henry's legitimacy, especially after the Simnel Rebellion proved how easily disaffected nobles could rally behind a Yorkist figurehead. Contemporary diplomats noted Henry's fury in the aftermath, ordering executions with unprecedented speed. Was Lincoln's death merely swept up in this purge, or did someone ensure he wouldn't live to inspire another revolt? Suspicion lingers around the role of Henry's mercenary captain, Martin Schwartz. A seasoned Swiss commander, Schwartz led the Tudor vanguard that day, the same forces that overran Lincoln's position. Later ballads and Burgundian reports hint that Schwartz's men were under orders to make no distinction of rank in the heat of battle, a phrase that takes on ominous meaning when applied to a royal cousin. Even more telling is the silence of Lincoln's remaining family. His brother Edmund, who'd fought alongside him, abruptly abandoned the Yorkist cause afterward, living out his days in quiet obscurity. Was this pragmatism, or did he know something about Stoke that forced his retreat? The enigma of Lincoln's end isn't just about one man's death. It's about how power consolidates in the aftermath of war. Henry couldn't afford martyrs, only forgotten casualties. By erasing Lincoln's body and memory, he turned a potential symbol of resistance into a footnote. Yet the whispers never fully faded. Decades later, when another pretender, Perkin Warbeck, emerged, men still spoke of Lincoln in hushed tones, wondering what might have been if he'd survived that bloody field. In the end, his fate embodies the wars of the Rose's cruelest truth. Sometimes history belongs not to those who fight hardest, but to those who control the story left behind. On the frigid morning of February 2nd, 1461, as Edward of York, soon to be Edward IV, gathered his troops near Mortimer's Cross, the sky above them split open in a vision so bizarre, men dropped to their knees in terror or awe. Above the mist-shrouded fields of Herefordshire, 3 luminous orbs blazed in the dawn light, each mirroring the sun's brilliance. To modern eyes, this was a textbook example of a parhelion, an atmospheric illusion caused by ice crystals refracting sunlight. But to the soldiers below, it could only mean one thing. The heavens themselves were choosing sides in the coming battle. Edward, just 18 years old but already a commander of sharp instincts, seized the moment with masterful propaganda. As his men gaped at the sky, he declared the triple suns a sign of divine favor, a celestial nod to the Holy Trinity, and more pointedly, a prophecy of victory for the House of York. The effect was electric. Superstition ran thick in medieval warfare, and the sight of what chroniclers called the sun in splendor multiplied, sent morale soaring among the Yorkist ranks. Later, Edward would adopt the sun in splendor as his personal emblem, a permanent reminder of the day the sky itself seemed to anoint him, but the science behind the phenomenon only deepens the intrigue. Parhelia, or sun dogs, occur when sunlight passes through hexagonal ice crystals suspended in high, cold cirrus clouds, bending the light to create phantom suns flanking the real one. Under perfect conditions, these illusions can be staggeringly vivid, complete with glowing halos and radiating beams. To an army steeped in biblical symbolism, where signs and portents carried the weight of prophecy, such a display would feel like direct intervention from God. The timing, too, was uncanny. The battle that followed would be Edward's first major victory, crushing Lancastrian forces and setting him on the path to the throne. Yet the Omen's legacy extends beyond inspiration. The Lancastrian commander Owen Tudor, grandfather of the future Henry VII, was captured and executed after the battle, his head displayed on the steps of Hereford's Market Cross. The three sons had heralded not just a military triumph, but the brutal efficiency with which Edward would dismantle his enemies. Centuries later, astronomers and historians still debate whether the parhelion truly influenced the battle's outcome or simply became a convenient narrative for Yorkist propaganda. What makes Mortimer's Cross unforgettable isn't just the spectacle, it's how the event crystallizes the wars of the Rose's uneasy blend of faith, science, and raw political theater. In an age where kingship was divinely ordained, a celestial marvel could be as potent as an army. Edward knew this instinctively. Whether by luck or calculation, he turned ice and light into a weapon, proving that in this war even the sky was a battlefield. And for those who witnessed it, the memory of those three sons would burn long after the blood had dried on the fields below. Richard III's final moments at Bosworth Field remain one of history's most contested last acts, a king's death shrouded in as much drama as his life. According to Shakespeare, his last word was treason, bellowed in rage as he swung his sword in vain, betrayed by those he trusted. It's a moment etched into popular memory, the monstrous ruler undone by his own villainy, howling into the abyss. But peel back the layers of Tudor propaganda, and the truth fragments into silence. Contemporary chronicles, those written closest to the battle, mention no dying declaration at all. So where does the disconnect begin, and what might Richard have truly said or not said? As his crown tumbled into the mud, the silence of early accounts speaks volumes. The Crowland Chronicle, penned by a Yorkist sympathizer shortly after Bosworth, describes Richard's death in stark, unembellished terms. Fell in the field, struck by many mortal wounds. No final soliloquy, no gasping accusation, just the brutal reality of medieval combat. Even John Roos, a historian initially favorable to Richard, omits any deathbed theatrics. This absence suggests Shakespeare's version was less historical fact and more dramatic invention, crafted decades later to vilify the last Plantagenet king for Tudor audiences. Yet the question lingers, if Richard didn't cry treason, what did his final moments look like? Eyewitness fragments offer glimpses. A French mercenary fighting for Henry Tudor reported seeing Richard unhorsed in the marsh, his banner-bearer slain beside him before being overwhelmed by Welsh pikemen. Another account claims he refused to flee, fighting on foot until a poleaxe struck his helmet with such force it drove the metal into his skull. If true, there would have been little breath left for speeches. But here's where psychology intrudes. A man facing death, especially one as fiercely intelligent as Richard, might have whispered something, perhaps a prayer given his reputed piety. Or a name, his son Edward, dead barely a year, or Anne Neville, his queen, whose passing had left him visibly shattered. The treason narrative likely sprouted from later political necessity. Henry VII had to justify his shaky claim, and painting Richard as a tyrant betrayed by his own men served that purpose. The real irony, if anyone shouted of treason that day, it might have been Richard's soldiers. Key Yorkist commanders like the Stanleys did switch sides mid-battle, sealing his fate. but in the chaos of slaughter, with visors locked and voices drowned by clashing steel, who could have heard? The enduring power of Richard's last words, real or imagined, lies in what they represent. Shakespeare's version gave the Tudors moral victory. The silence of history leaves room for a more complex man. Perhaps the truth is neither treason nor silence, but something in between. A king who fought fiercely, fell quietly, and left the living to weaponize his end. 5 centuries later, we're still caught between the cry and the quiet, debating which version of his death matters more. The death of Henry VI in the Tower of London in May 1471 should have been the quiet end of a failed king, a footnote in the violent saga of the Wars of the Roses. Instead, his story took a turn so strange it defies logic. The man who'd lost his crown twice, whose reign was marked by mental collapse and military disaster, became something nobody expected, a posthumous martyr, a candidate for sainthood, and the center of a cult that outlived the dynasty that killed him. Henry's burial was anything but royal. Stripped of ceremony, his body was hastily interred at Chertsey Abbey, a quiet monastery far from the political heart of England. No effigy, no procession, just a simple grave that might have vanished into obscurity, if not for the miracles. Within months, pilgrims began flocking to the site, claiming prayers to the deposed king had cured ailments, spared children from plague, even brought rain to parched fields. The abbey's monks, initially wary, soon leaned into the phenomenon, recording over 200 alleged miracles by 1484. How did a man once derided as a feeble puppet transform into a heavenly intercessor? The answer lies in the stark contrast between Henry's life and death. In an era of ruthless kings like Edward IV and Richard III, Henry's piety, once seen as weakness, became his redemption. He'd founded Eton and King's College, Cambridge. He'd worn a hair shirt beneath his robes. He'd wept openly at the suffering of others. Where his enemies saw incompetence, the common people saw sanctity. His violent end, almost certainly ordered by Edward, only cemented his image as an innocent slain by tyrants. The parallels to Thomas Becket, murdered in his own cathedral a century earlier, were too potent to ignore. Centuries later, Henry's grave would yield chilling secrets. When his body was exhumed in 1910, forensic examination revealed a skull fractured by at least 2 heavy blows, consistent with chroniclers' claims he'd been sticked full of deadly holes by assassins. More curious was the state of his hair, still streaked with blood, matted and clinging to the bone. Even in death, the violence of his passing remained eerily preserved. Yet the true mystery isn't how Henry died, but how his legacy twisted so dramatically. By the time Henry VII, his distant kinsman, took the throne, the cult of Henry VI had grown too popular to suppress. The Tudors, eager to legitimize their rule, quietly encouraged veneration of their Lancastrian predecessor. Pilgrims' badges bearing his likeness sold by the thousands, and whispers spread that his relics, a hat, a glove, could ward off evil. In death, Henry achieved what he never could in life, unifying a fractured England not by sword but by the sheer power of collective memory, the final irony. The man who couldn't hold a crown in life became, in death, a symbol of resistance against tyranny. His ghost haunted the Tudor imagination, a reminder that even the weakest king could cast a long shadow. And in that shadow, the Wars of the Roses found its strangest epilogue, not on a battlefield but on bended knee at the grave of a saint who never was. The Wars of the Roses didn't just end at Bosworth Field, they seeped into the foundations of the Tudor dynasty, leaving behind a trail of unresolved mysteries that still captivate us today. These 25 enigmatic events, from vanished princes and cursed gold to whispered prophecies and stolen crowns, aren't just footnotes in history. They're the shadows that shaped England's future, the unanswered questions that forced the Tudors to rewrite the past in order to secure their throne. Whether it was Henry VII's frantic efforts to erase pretenders or Elizabeth of York's haunted silence about her lost brothers, every twist in the Tudor narrative was a reaction to the riddles the Plantagenets left behind. Consider how these mysteries became political weapons. The fate of the princes in the Tower wasn't just a tragedy, it was a rallying cry Henry Tudor exploited to justify his invasion. The sudden death of Edward IV wasn't merely bad luck. It created the power vacuum that allowed Richard III to seize the throne and later for Henry to topple him. Even the supernatural, like Richard's dream before Bosworth or the three sons at Mortimer's Cross, was woven into propaganda, proof that divine judgment favored the victors. The Tudors didn't just inherit a kingdom, they inherited a web of secrets, and their entire reign was spent trying to control the narrative. But the real allure lies in what we still don't know. Were the princes murdered, or did one escape? Was Margaret of Anjou pulling strings from exile? Did Eleanor Cobham truly dabble in witchcraft, or was she a pawn in a noble feud? These gaps in the record aren't just academic, they're invitations. Every generation reinterprets the clues, from Victorian historians scouring monastery ledgers to modern archaeologists dusting off skeletons for DNA tests. The beauty of this era is that it refuses to be pinned down. Just when we think we've solved one puzzle, like the recent identification of Richard III's remains, another emerges, like the vanishing of Edward IV's will or the truth behind Perkin Warbeck's audacious claim. So where does that leave us? Not with tidy answers, but with something far richer, the thrill of the hunt. Dive into the primary sources and you'll find contradictions everywhere. Compare Tudor chronicles with Yorkist sympathizers' accounts, and you'll see history isn't a single story, it's a battleground of perspectives. That's why these mysteries endure. They force us to question how power distorts truth, how legends are born from chaos, and how the past never really stays buried. If this journey through the Wars of the Roses has left you with more questions than answers, good, that means you're paying attention. History isn't about memorizing dates, it's about grappling with the unresolved. So keep digging, debate the theories, visit the castles where these dramas unfolded. And if you're hungry for more deep dives into the shadows of the past, don't forget to subscribe, because the next mystery is always waiting to be uncovered.